It was late October when Emily Carter drove into Willow Creek, the air thick with that kind of autumn chill that spoke of distant whispers and unsettled spirits. The town's welcome sign appeared as if out of nowhere, nearly hidden by overgrown branches and covered in a layer of grime that seemed to indicate no one had cared to clean it in years. The place hadn't changed much since she'd last been there, since the night Lily vanished without a trace. Emily's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white as she remembered the haunting silence of that evening. She was here because of another disappearance, a young woman, much like Lily, gone without a trace in the same season, under circumstances Emily found chillingly familiar. The town had buried its secrets, but Emily had spent the past decade digging them back up, clawing at the dirt until her hands bled, driven by the need for answers. Sheriff Tom Bennett stood on the steps of the station, his weathered face etched with something between suspicion and reluctant recognition. He had aged in the years since Emily had seen him, the burden of unsolved disappearances like lines on his face. He dismissed Emily's insistence that the recent incident mirrored Lily's disappearance. "You always did have a wild imagination, Emily," he said, though his eyes told a different story. Haunted, guilty, a man whose past was a constant weight on his shoulders. The town hadn't changed much, but the secret seemed thicker now, like the fog that settled in the early mornings, enveloping everything in a cold shroud. Emily's first real lead came from an unexpected source. Jacob Wallace, a drifter, his eyes carrying a haunted look of someone who knew too much, approached her at the town diner. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the clinking of plates and the chatter of townsfolk. "The lights in the woods," he said, leaning closer, his breath smelling faintly of cigarettes. "They're not just stories. I've seen them." He looked around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "My brother, he saw him too before he vanished." Emily spent the next afternoon at the local library with Martha Eldridge, the town historian. Martha's obsession with the dark history of Willow Creek had made her a pariah in the eyes of many, her house filled with yellowed papers and boxes of documents no one wanted to see. "It's always the same," Martha said, her voice shaking as she laid out a series of old photographs and newspaper clippings. The faces of the missing stared up at Emily, eyes frozen in time. "Every 13 years, the same time of year. They all had it, that mark." Martha pointed to a faded photograph, a small but distinct birthmark on the back of a young man's neck. Emily's mind raced as she started piecing it all together. The pattern, the sacrifices, the eerie consistency of it all. She visited the sheriff again, her heart pounding as she confronted him with Martha's records. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the old photos. He sighed deeply, his facade cracking as he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a similar mark. "I saw it on the last victim," he confessed, his voice heavy with years of regret. "I knew, but I was too scared to follow it. I didn't want to believe." Jacob reappeared that night, knocking on Emily's door, his eyes bloodshot, his expression haunted. "My brother had that mark too," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "I've been trying to run from this my whole life, but it keeps coming back. The lights, the disappearances, it's all connected." The three of them stood at the edge of the woods, the wind whispering secrets through the branches. The town's dark past was buried somewhere deep within, an ancient pact, rituals to keep prosperity in exchange for blood. Emily could feel her pulse in her throat, her fear mixing with anger, with desperation. They ventured further, their flashlights flickering as if something unseen toyed with them. The woods grew denser, darker, until they stumbled upon it, an old stone altar, covered in moss, and surrounded by decaying candles. The air was thick, heavy, almost choking. Sheriff Bennett's face paled as he touched the worn carvings on the altar, his voice barely a whisper. "This is it. This is where it all started." Emily's gaze shifted to Jacob, whose eyes seemed lost, staring at something beyond the darkness. "It's not just a pact," he said, his voice trembling. "It's a cycle. It won't stop until someone ends it." A low, almost inaudible hum began to echo through the woods, and the lights appeared. Strange, floating orbs that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air grew colder, the ground beneath them trembling. Martha's words echoed in Emily's mind. Sacrifices to ensure prosperity. She looked at the sheriff, then at Jacob. They had to end this, had to break the cycle, expose the truth. The lights grew brighter, almost blinding, as Emily stepped towards the altar, her heart pounding, her mind made up. She didn't know if they would make it out of the woods alive, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let Willow Creek claim another victim. Story 2. Nora Hastings' breath fogged in the chill of Cedar Hollow's early morning air. The crunch of fallen leaves beneath her boots mixed with the distant, restless whispering of the wind. She tightened her grip on the worn map of the hiking trails, the same trails where her fiancé Mark had disappeared a year ago. The map was covered in her frantic notes, arrows pointing to places she had to visit, places where Mark might still be. No one else seemed willing to help, certainly not the locals who only offered hollow condolences. Never direct eye contact. It was her third day in Cedar Hollow. The town was picturesque but veiled in an unsettling silence, as if the people here knew secrets they weren't willing to share. She had tried to stay under the radar, but an old park ranger had already caught her snooping around. She found herself sitting in a smoky diner across from Greg Thornton, who sipped his coffee and eyed her with a mix of concern and something that almost looked like pity. "You won't find him," Greg said, breaking the silence. His words landed heavily, as though he'd practiced them 1,000 times. "Not in these woods, anyway. Cedar Hollow's not just any forest, it's got a mind of its own." Nora resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She'd heard versions of this before, cryptic warnings, half-explanations meant to deter outsiders from asking too many questions. But her heart raced at the subtle emphasis in his tone, like he was holding back more than he was saying. Greg sighed, rubbing his temple. "Fog comes in fast, faster than you'd think possible. It'll swallow everything. People get lost, but there's more to it. Sometimes you can hear things. Whispers." He paused, as if waiting for Nora to react. She gave him nothing, and he went on. "Sounds like it's right behind you, or just out of sight." Later, she met Megan Fields, the artist from the outskirts of town. Megan's paintings were unlike anything Nora had ever seen. The canvases were raw, full of sorrow, depicting people lost in the woods, faces twisted in expressions of confusion and terror. When Nora asked about them, Megan seemed startled. "They come to me in dreams," Megan said, her eyes haunted. "I don't know these people. I think maybe I'm just imagining things, but it's like they're trying to tell me something." It wasn't until that night when Megan invited Nora over to her studio that things got truly strange. Nora stood before a half-finished painting, her heart dropping into her stomach. The eyes staring back at her from the canvas were Mark's. She recognized his messy curls, the deep lines that creased his forehead when he laughed. She turned to Megan, her throat tightening. "How do you know him?" Megan looked shaken. "I don't," she whispered. "I swear." Greg's warnings and Megan's eerie artwork pushed Nora deeper into Cedar Hollow's darkness. That's when Eddie Simmons entered the picture. He was a conspiracy theorist with a blog, one that had caught Nora's eye while she was researching Mark's disappearance. Eddie was the kind of man who made you question whether he was brilliant or completely unhinged, and Nora suspected it was a mix of both. "They're hiding something in those woods," Eddie told Nora, his eyes wide and fervent. "The government. I've seen the symbols, the carvings on the trees. They're not natural. They're warnings. Mark didn't just get lost, Nora. He was taken." As ridiculous as it sounded, Nora felt a chill run down her spine. Eddie had evidence. Photographs of intricate symbols carved deep into tree bark, diagrams that seemed to map out something hidden within the forest depths. One night, Nora and Megan experienced something impossible. They were sitting in Megan's studio, the air heavy with paint fumes and candlelight flickering across the canvases. It started as a dull ringing in Nora's ears, and she watched as Megan's eyes went unfocused. Her hand trembled, lifting to point at nothing. Then they both saw it, a fleeting image of Mark, his face pale and frightened, standing amidst swirling fog, his hand outstretched as though reaching for them. It lasted only a heartbeat, but Nora felt the touch of his fingers brush against hers, and she gasped. Greg was waiting at the edge of town when they came to him with what they'd seen. He looked tired, more tired than Nora had ever seen a man look, and finally he spoke of the things he'd kept hidden for years. "There's something wrong in those woods," he admitted, voice low. "I've seen things too. Figures, whispers, things that shouldn't exist. I never talked about it, because who would believe me?" The three of them, along with Eddie, decided to confront whatever lay hidden in Cedar Hollow. They went together, trekking deeper than anyone had dared. Eddie led the way, obsessively following the carvings he'd documented, tracing the path of the symbols. Deep within the forest, they found it, an ancient stone archway, overgrown with moss and vines. The air seemed different there, thicker, and a strange hum filled the clearing. Eddie, ever the believer, stepped closer, his fingers brushing against the stones. "It's a portal," he murmured almost in awe. "A doorway to another place." Greg's face paled, and he stepped back. "We shouldn't be here," he said. But Nora couldn't look away. She could almost see it, the shimmer in the air, like a mirage, and beyond it, the vague outline of Mark, his eyes wide with hope. Megan reached for her, her voice trembling. "We have to try, Nora. We have to bring him back." The ground beneath them seemed to shift, the forest blurring, the air pulling at them. Nora took a deep breath, feeling the world tilt, her heart pounding with fear and hope. For Mark, for answers, for whatever lay beyond that gateway. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything changed. Story 3. Dr. Amanda Collins arrived in Silent Springs with her logical mind ready to tackle the strange wave of disappearances plaguing the town. She was here to study what she thought was a classic case of group hysteria. But the longer she stayed, the less things made sense. The townspeople were wary, their faces lined with exhaustion and suspicion. When Amanda tried to talk to them, they spoke in hushed tones, eyes darting to the shadows as if something or someone was listening. Amanda's skepticism was soon put to the test when she came across Peter Shaw, a reclusive writer known in town for his eerie stories. Peter's latest manuscript was unlike anything she had ever read. It detailed the disappearances with an accuracy that sent chills down her spine. Every missing person, every detail of their final moments in Silent Springs was captured on the pages. Peter seemed reluctant to explain, his eyes darkened by sleepless nights. Eventually, he admitted to Amanda that the stories came to him in visions, flashes that left him reeling, drained, and terrified. Meanwhile, Lucy Rivers, a spirited teenager whose curiosity often led her to trouble, had her own discoveries. She had spent hours in the old church's archives, sifting through dusty tomes and forgotten records. She came across an old journal, penned by a priest in the late 1800s, that recounted disappearances hauntingly similar to those happening now. The journal spoke of shadows that crept through the town, of people vanishing without a trace, and of the town's repeated cycle of loss. Father Jonathan Mills, the town's priest, was struggling. His congregation was shrinking as more and more people went missing, and his once steady faith now wavered. His sermons grew desperate, urging the remaining townsfolk to pray, to seek spiritual protection. He spoke of evil, of darkness encroaching upon their lives. His voice cracked as he pleaded with them, his fear all too evident. Amanda found herself questioning everything she believed in. Strange occurrences began to plague her nights, dreams of the missing, vivid and heartbreaking, shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. The rational explanations she clung to slipped further and further from her grasp, and she found herself drawn deeper into the town's mysteries. It was Peter who finally revealed the truth behind his visions. As a child, he had found a peculiar artifact in the woods, a small carved stone that seemed to hum with energy. He kept it, fascinated by its strangeness, but as he grew older, the visions began. visions that seemed to connect him to the town's dark history. He showed the artifact to Amanda, its surface covered in symbols that looked ancient, worn by time. Amanda could feel the unease radiating from it, a sense that it was something far beyond her understanding. Lucy, emboldened by her findings in the church, convinced Amanda and Peter to follow her to the abandoned mine on the outskirts of town. The mine, according to the old journal, was where the artifact had originally been found. It was also the site of a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of several miners over a century ago. The entrance was boarded up, but Lucy had come prepared, prying the boards loose with determination that belied her young age. The air inside the mine was thick, stale, and filled with an oppressive weight. The deeper they ventured, the more they felt it, a sense that they were not alone, that the shadows around them were watching, waiting. They reached a cavern deep within, where the walls were lined with symbols identical to those on Peter's artifact. In the center of the cavern was a pit, and as they peered down, they saw the remains, bones, clothing, the sad remnants of those who had vanished. It was then that the ground began to tremble. The mine, already unstable, began to collapse. Dust filled the air, and rocks tumbled from above. In the chaos, Peter dropped the artifact, and it shattered upon the cavern floor. The humming stopped, the oppressive energy lifting as though a weight had been removed. They scrambled to escape, barely making it out as the mine collapsed behind them, sealing the cavern and its secrets away once more. Silent Springs seemed to breathe again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The disappearances ceased, but the cost had been heavy. The artifact, now broken, no longer held power over the town, but the memory of those lost lingered. Amanda knew she would never forget the faces of those who had vanished, nor the strange, irrational truth she had uncovered in Silent Springs, a truth that defied everything she had once believed. Stroy 4. Detective Sarah Blake returned to Birchwood, a town that held nothing but pain and broken promises. The crisp autumn air felt suffocating as she walked past the familiar buildings, her mind heavy with memories of her daughter's disappearance 8 years ago. She was here on official business. Another wave of disappearances, and one case in particular, had shaken her to the core. The missing girl looked like her daughter, even down to the small birthmark on her wrist. Birchwood felt like it was playing a cruel trick on her, and she had no choice but to face it. Eli Carter, the town's journalist, was relentless. He had always been a thorn in the side of Birchwood's establishment, digging for the truth no matter how dangerous it was. He approached Sarah as soon as he heard she was back in town, his notebook already open, ready for her words. He wasn't interested in official statements, though. He wanted to know if she'd found any links between the new disappearances and Birchwood's dark past. Eli had uncovered whispers of a secret society operating in Birchwood, one that was rumored to be behind the disappearances, their influence reaching far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Naomi Bishop had arrived in Birchwood just a week earlier. A nurse by profession, she had been drawn here by a series of cryptic letters left at her doorstep. The letters spoke of her connection to Birchwood's past, of secrets her family had buried long ago. She didn't know what to believe, but the pull to discover the truth was irresistible. Her parents had always been evasive when it came to their past, and Naomi had the nagging feeling that these disappearances were more personal than she wanted to admit. While repairing an old building on the edge of town, Caleb Foster stumbled upon something no one was supposed to see. Beneath the floorboards, hidden beneath years of dirt and neglect, he found an entrance to a network of tunnels. The tunnels were old, their walls lined with rusted hooks and remnants of what could only be described as holding cells. Caleb, who knew more about Birchwood than most, realized he had found something sinister, evidence that linked the town's disappearances to a dark history of kidnappings, a secret hidden beneath the feet of every resident. The four of them found themselves drawn together by their separate investigations. Sarah, desperate for answers about her daughter. Eli, determined to expose the corruption at Birchwood's heart. Naomi, searching for the truth about her family, and Caleb, the reluctant bearer of the town's darkest secrets. Together, they pieced together the story, a secret society that had existed in Birchwood for centuries, one that believed in maintaining the town's prosperity through dark rituals that required human sacrifices. The records they found were damning, lists of names, dates that corresponded with the town's worst periods of disappearances. The society, it seemed, had deep roots in Birchwood's history, their influence reaching into the highest levels of the town's government. For Sarah, the revelation was almost too much to bear. The thought that her daughter might have been a victim of this society tore at her sanity. She struggled to maintain her composure, her hands trembling as she pored over the records, her eyes stinging with tears. She had always blamed herself for her daughter's disappearance, but now she realized there was something far darker at play, something she could never have protected her from. Naomi's investigation led her to a truth she had feared. Her parents had been members of the society, their involvement hidden behind a facade of respectability. The letters had been a warning, a plea from someone who had known the truth and wanted Naomi to uncover it. She was torn between her love for her family and the knowledge of what they had been part of. The weight of it threatened to crush her, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. The final confrontation took place in the tunnels beneath Birchwood. The air was damp, the darkness oppressive, as they moved through the narrow passages, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The remaining members of the society were there, gathered for what they believed would be another ritual to ensure Birchwood's continued prosperity. Sarah led the charge, her heart pounding, her mind filled with thoughts of her daughter. Eli captured everything on his camera, determined to expose the truth, while Caleb and Naomi flanked Sarah, their determination unwavering. The standoff was tense, words exchanged in the dim light, accusations flying. The society members, cloaked and masked, spoke of duty, of sacrifice for the greater good. But Sarah saw nothing but monsters, people who had taken her daughter, who had taken so many others. It all happened in a blur. Shouts, a struggle, and then the collapse. One of the society members, in a desperate attempt to escape, triggered an explosion, causing the tunnel to begin collapsing around them. They barely made it out, the society members either trapped or dead in the rubble. Birchwood was finally free from their grasp, but the cost had been great. Sarah stood at the entrance to the tunnels, her face streaked with dirt and tears, knowing that while the society was gone, the pain they had caused would never fully fade. Naomi, Eli, and Caleb stood beside her, each of them changed by what they had seen, by the truth they had uncovered. Birchwood was a town built on secrets, and now at least, some of those secrets had seen the light. But for Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. She had come looking for her daughter, and though she had found answers, the closure she sought still eluded her. The shadows over Birchwood had lifted, but their scars would remain. Story 5. Claire Mitchell arrived in Ravenwood, her car kicking up dust as she drove down the narrow, winding road that led into town. It was a small, isolated place, the kind of town where everyone knew each other and secrets were buried deep. Claire had always been fascinated by history, particularly the kind that never made it into the books, the stories that towns like Ravenwood tried to forget. But this was more than an academic pursuit. Her grandmother had vanished here under mysterious circumstances when Claire was just a child, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how hard the townspeople tried to keep her away. It didn't take long for Claire to realize that Ravenwood was different. The townsfolk were distant, their gazes cold and guarded whenever she asked about the past. Doors were literally shut in her face, and whispers followed her wherever she went. The entire town seemed to be living under a shadow, and the more she asked, the more she realized just how much people were afraid to speak. Ben Harper was a former science teacher, someone who prided himself on his rational mind. He didn't buy into ghost stories or urban legends, and when Claire approached him for help, his first instinct was to brush her off. But something about her determination, the way her eyes burned with a need for answers, drew him in. He agreed to help her, if only to prove that whatever was happening had a perfectly logical explanation. As the days went on, though, Ben found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The things they uncovered, the strange symbols carved into trees, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, were not so easily dismissed. Samantha Reed, the local librarian, had spent most of her life in Ravenwood. She loved its old legends, the stories passed down through generations, and she knew more about the town's history than anyone else. When Claire and Ben came to her, desperate for answers, she hesitated. There were stories people didn't tell outsiders, stories about the forgotten ones, restless spirits said to reclaim those who disturbed their peace. But she could see the fear in Claire's eyes and the desperation, and she knew she couldn't keep silent. She took them to the old section of the library, pulling out dusty tomes and faded maps, pointing out the places where the disappearances had happened, all of them aligning with the phases of the moon. It was Miles Cooper, the town mechanic, who provided the missing piece. Miles had always been fascinated by the unsolved cases of Ravenwood, a hobby that had earned him more than a few sideways glances from the townspeople. He had kept records, notes, and newspaper clippings, and he knew the pattern by heart. The disappearances always aligned with the lunar cycle, a grim reminder that something dark lurked beneath Ravenwood's seemingly calm surface. When Claire, Ben, and Samantha approached him, he didn't hesitate. He showed them everything he had, the evidence that pointed to something far more sinister than any of them had imagined. Together, they ventured into the woods, following the clues that led them to a hidden graveyard. The place was old, the gravestones covered in moss, their inscriptions worn by time. It was clear that this place had been deliberately hidden, the trees growing thick around it, the air heavy with a sense of unease. As they walked among the graves, they found names that matched those on Miles's list. People who had vanished, their lives erased from the town's memory. It was Samantha who found the inscription on a crumbling stone at the center of the graveyard, the words barely legible: "The forgotten ones shall not be disturbed." For Ben, it was too much. He had come here to prove that there was no such thing as curses or spirits, but the evidence was undeniable. He had always prided himself on his logical mind, but now, standing in that graveyard, he felt it shatter. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and he struggled to breathe, the reality of what they had uncovered too much to bear. Their encounter in the graveyard was something none of them would ever forget. As night fell, the air grew colder, and they could feel it. A presence, something watching them from the shadows. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment it was as if the entire forest had come alive. Claire felt her heart pound in her chest, her eyes darting to every movement in the dark. Samantha clutched her arm, her face pale, and Miles stood frozen, his flashlight shaking in his hand. And then they saw them. Shadows, figures moving between the graves, their forms indistinct but undeniably there. The forgotten ones had awoken, and they were not pleased. In the end, it was the town elders who held the answers. Claire, Ben, Samantha, and Miles confronted them, demanding to know the truth. The elders were old, their faces lined with the weight of their secrets. They spoke of a pact, made long ago, to protect Ravenwood from a terrible curse. The forgotten ones were the price the town had paid, the souls of those who had been sacrificed to keep Ravenwood safe. It had worked for a time, but now the past had come back to haunt them. The cost of breaking the pact was high, but Claire knew they had no choice. The town could no longer live under the shadow of its past, its secrets buried beneath lies and fear. The elders agreed, their voices trembling as they spoke the words that would end the curse, the weight of their guilt finally lifting. Ravenwood was free, but the scars would remain, the memory of the forgotten ones, a reminder of the price they had paid for their safety. As they left the elders' home, Claire looked back at the town, the lights flickering in the windows, the shadows no longer looming quite so dark. She had come here searching for her grandmother, and though she hadn't found her, she had found the truth. It wasn't the closure she had hoped for, but it was enough. The forgotten ones had been remembered, and Ravenwood could finally move forward, free from the weight of its haunted past.